Hello. You're watching Much Ado About Something today, and I'm Donna. Well, it's full summer. I'm telling you, things are in full swing, and it's really busy around here. I bet it's busy where you are too. Well, if you've been around a while, you know I watch my 6 grandchildren. They're ages from 11 down to 4. There's 6 of them, and they're a handful. Some are something else. So I've been spending a lot of time with them and taking care of them, fixing a lot of meals, a lot of cold drinks, and trying to slip and slide and just enjoy the time that I have with them. It's so hot today. It's supposed to be around 98 degrees. And I have been busy. Me and Donald went to a friend's house and picked over a bushel of green beans. So I've had to snap those string and snap those bushel of green beans, and I've got them. I'm not sure if I'm going to freeze those green beans or can them, but I've got a bushel of green beans that I'm going to have to deal with. I also have a lot of things that I've picked from the garden. I went and picked this out of the garden today. This is the cucumbers and the zucchini that I got out today. I haven't weighed this. If you are familiar, you know that we've got a small vegetable garden out back, and we're weighing everything so that at the end of the year we can kind of tally up and see how much that little garden has saved us. So I've got these here that I've got to weigh and tally up, and then I've got to prepare probably to make some pickles. But today what I wanted to share with you is this squash. Now these squash are a little bit bigger than we usually get. This one's got a little bad place. I'll cut that off when we get ready to use it. But this squash here is kind of knobbier and more overgrown than we usually pick it for frying. But there's a delicious recipe that you can use this overgrown squash like this for, and it's a stew. It's called squash stew, and we ate it growing up, and it's much like an oyster stew, and I'm going to show you how to fix that today. Now I've got my soup pot here. I've got it on the stove, and I've got it heating on about medium over there. I'm going to put a little oil in this pot, and I'm going to chop up an onion. I'm going to chop up this onion and brown it. This is my compost bin, a little pot I'm using right now to throw the compost in. I sometimes save these onion skins to make broth out of to add to other recipes, but today is a busy day, so I'm just going to go ahead and put those in a compost bin. Get my onion chopped up so I can go ahead and get this squash stew going. I'm going to brown these onions. I put a little bit of oil. You can use the oil of your choice, whatever you normally cook with. And I'm going ahead and using a whole medium onion. This is just a yellow cooking onion. That's what I usually use when I'm making soups or stews. But if I didn't have that, I'd use whatever onion I had on hand. Go ahead and put this in this oil we got heating up. Now I've got another pot here. This is my green beans. These are my green beans that I cooked, and I'll have to can here in a little bit. So they'll be in the way since I don't have anywhere else to put those, but I'm going to work right here from this pot right here. This will be where I'll be cooking the squash stew today. So I'm going to go ahead and add these onions to this pot. Now we're going to go ahead and brown these and let them get good and toasty brown. And we're going to chop up the squash. Now the squash that we're using are kind of the ones that's a little bit overgrown. They're a little tough. They're good to stew because they'll be in that, you know, on the heat for a little bit, and it'll soften them up a lot. That's the kind of squash we're going to use today. They're a little bit too tough for frying, but they're just right for stewing. So I just chop the squash up into small pieces. This is something that we ate growing up. Our family loves oyster stew, and we usually eat oyster stew at different occasions. But this was something that was really good when oysters were not available. I think they're more readily available now than they used to be. You could used to, when we were growing up, only buy oysters in the months that ended with an R. And that would be the time that the oysters would be in the store. But now I see oysters all the time, so evidently that's something that's changed. Just chop your squash, and this is yellow crookneck squash. This is the kind we use, is yellow squash. I've never tried a different squash for this squash stew. And it's a good way to use up some of the squash that you have in your garden. If you have an abundance like we do, we always have an abundance, and I've got several favorite family recipes that I love to use up the squash. I'm going to go ahead and add this to the onions. I'm going to chop up these other two. Got our onions in there browning some. And I'm just going to add the squash right in there with them. We use about 3 medium to small squash. You can use as many as you like, as many as you would like to taste. Now this is not 100% just like oyster stew, but it is very similar to that. Has a very similar taste to like an oyster stew would be. This is a family favorite. This will be in my family cookbook. We'll cut off that bad place. And that's where the squash just laid on the ground. just want to dice your squash up into just small little cubes. Not tiny, but small. Go ahead and cut this other one up while I'm at it. You can certainly cut it up bigger or smaller if you'd like. This is the size. When we made it, we always traditionally just cut it up maybe an inch square or smaller. Now this sometimes varies the amount of squash that you have depending on what's coming in out of your garden. This is one of those things that you're just using what you have out of the garden, so there may be more or less squash the day you decide to make this. And you don't have to use the overgrown squash. You can go ahead and use whatever size squash that you pick. They don't have to be overgrown. It's just, I think this recipe was developed so that you could use that overgrown squash and not waste any of it. And all the more tender squash was used to fry. So I'm just going to go ahead and cook these just a little bit. Let this onions and this squash just cook till it's tender, and then I'll show you the next step. I would say probably cook this for at least 10 or 15 minutes. I'll go ahead and set the timer, and when that 10 or 15 minutes is up, we'll move to the next step. I put a lid on here just to help things cook a little faster. We got a few more minutes to go. But you can see that kind of steamed and softened up the squash. We'll just let that finish. It's 2 more minutes. Okay, our timers just went off. We've got this cooked for about 15 minutes, and it's tenderized the squash a little bit, and the onions are cooked some. And so the next step, we're going to add a whole stick of butter. We're going to add a whole stick of butter that's just been cut up here. If you cut it up, it helps it to melt faster. We're just going to stir that right in. And that butter is for richness and for flavor. And I'm going to go ahead and take this time to go ahead and salt this squash and onions. I haven't put any seasoning in it so far, so I'm just going to add a little bit of salt. And black pepper. Now you can leave whichever one of these that you don't need or don't want in, you can leave it out. But this is traditionally the way we make our squash stew and our oyster stew. So this squash stew is a mock oyster stew. It puts you in the mind of the flavor and the texture of oyster stew. And it's a good way to use up those tough squash that you've got that you've harvested from your garden. And if you're allergic to shellfish, it's a good substitute for that. So it's an excellent dish to try and see how you like it. Well, we've got that butter all melted and everything. Now we're going to add our milk. Now you want to use whole milk, just like you would if you was making your oyster stew. And of course, we won't be boiling this milk. We'll just be simmering it. So we're going to just add it right into our cooked squash and onions. That was about a quart of milk. You just want to stir that in and let it simmer for a little bit. It'll soften that squash even more, and it'll absorb the flavors of the onions and the squash and the butter. So we'll let that simmer for another 10 or 15 minutes. Now it's getting right here at the end. The squash has stewed until it's softened. I've got Old Bay seasoning right here. And I'm going to put 2 tablespoons of that in. Now I don't always use Old Bay seasoning in our oyster stew, but sometimes I do. That was not traditional. That's just something that I've added since I've moved out on my own, and that's a spice that I really like. I love the way it smells and the way it tastes, and it is especially good in this squash stew or our mock oyster stew. Now Donald likes a little bit of cayenne in his. Right here's a little bit of cayenne. I'm not going to add that in. I'm going to let him add that because I think there's enough seasoning here in what we've got here. But you want to cook until your squash is just really, really soft. You don't want your squash crunchy in no way, shape, or form. You want it to cook until it's really soft. Now I'm going to go ahead and get my bowl ready. This will be my lunch today. This mock oyster stew that's made with squash. Well, I thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it's something that you'll try. It saves your squash, the bigger squash, from having to be thrown away. It's delicious. If you are a vegetarian or if you are allergic to shellfish, it's just a really good stew to try. Donald will be happy that I have that for supper tonight. Thank you for joining me today. And like always, until next time.